In early June, deep within the Amazon's uncharted green expanse, Dr. Eris Thorne's expedition to find a plant of legendary power was cut short by the sudden, violent silence of a plane crash. The official report cited a tragic accident, a story that held until investigators opened an evidence bag from the wreckage. Clutched in the dead man's hand was an impossible artifact, a piece of technology that defied all known science and proved his death was anything but an accident. The humidity in the Brasilia office was a physical weight, a constant reminder of the jungle that was always waiting just beyond the capital's concrete horizons. Keichul, an investigator for Brazil's National Indian Foundation, felt the oppressive atmosphere seep into his bones as he stared at the digital audio file on his screen. Its sterile, alphanumeric designation, Case 734-AT, belied the human tragedy it contained. He slipped on a pair of heavy, sound-isolating headphones, the worn leatherette pads sighing as they settled over his ears. A single click of the mouse was all it took to bridge the distance between his air-conditioned room and the final moments of Dr. Eris Thorne. The recording began not with a voice, but with the hollow drone of a single-engined Cessna. It was a sound. Callow knew intimately, the sound of isolation and the fragile thread of technology that connected remote outposts to the world. A faint crackle of static hissed beneath the engine's hum, a constant, abrasive counterpoint. He closed his eyes, letting the sounds paint a picture of the vast, indifferent wilderness below the aircraft. For a full 30 seconds, this was the only sound, the monotonous lullaby of a routine flight over an endless sea of green. Then, a man's voice, clear and suffused with an almost electric excitement, broke the mechanical monotony. Log entry June 4th. This is Dr. Eris Thorne. His Portuguese was precise, academic, yet it failed to conceal the tremor of profound discovery that vibrated through every word. Altitude is stable, visibility is, well, it's perfect. A soft, self-effacing laugh echoed faintly, a ghost in the machine. The geological survey maps for this sector are utterly fantastically wrong. Kaziel leaned forward, his focus narrowing to the disembodied voice. He could picture Thorne, a man he'd never met, craning his neck to look out the small plane window, his mind racing with the implications of his find. There is a formation here, a caldera, I believe, but it's not volcanic. The excitement in his voice was building, layer by layer, a scientist on the precipice of a breakthrough that would redefine his career. It's a perfect circle, a depression in the landscape, almost unnaturally symmetrical from this height. Keichul's own finger traced an imaginary circle on the scarred surface of his desk. He had seen countless satellite images of the basin, and nothing like this had ever been officially charted or reported. The vegetation within the circle is distinct, visibly different from the surrounding canopy. Thorne's breathing was becoming slightly more labored, not from fear but from the sheer adrenaline of the moment. The color is a deeper green, almost blue in this light, and my preliminary spectral analysis readings are there off the charts. The sound of rustling paper came through the headphones, the dry whisper of Thorne consulting his notes or instruments. I'm picking up an energy signature from the center of the depression. It's faint, but it is consistent, and it does not correspond to any known geological or biological source. He paused, and in that brief silence, Cale could feel the weight of unspoken questions hanging in the air. It's almost as if something down there is broadcasting. The investigator opened his eyes, staring at the unmoving waveform on his computer monitor. The word broadcasting snagged in his mind, a sharp, incongruous detail in the context of an ethnobotanical survey. I'm descending for a closer look. The engine pitch changed subtly, a deeper groan as the plane began to lose altitude. The pilot is concerned about a weather front moving in, but I have to get a better reading. The next few moments were filled with the steady drone of the engine and the faint, almost inaudible clicks of Thorne operating his equipment. The sense of adventure was palpable, a man pushing the boundaries of knowledge in one of the last truly wild places on Earth. Cale found himself holding his breath, a spectator to a drama that had concluded days ago. It's a plant, Thorne whispered, his voice now hushed with awe. My God, the legends are true. It's glowing. The word hung in the air. Surreal and impossible. Cale felt a prickle of unease on his arms, the kind that came when a case first tilted from the mundane into the strange. The bioluminescence is visible even in daylight. A sudden, loud burst of static tore through the recording, sharp and violent. What the hell was that? Thorne's voice was suddenly tight with alarm. The engine noise faltered, sputtering once, twice. A new sound emerged, a high-pitched, metallic screech that seemed to violate the natural order of the jungle. "We've lost power! Mayday! Mayday! This is Papa Tango 39er Charlie." The co-pilot's voice, panicked and strained, yelled in the background, but the words were unintelligible. "We have a complete systems failure," Thorne shouted, his voice now raw with terror. A jarring percussive bang echoed, followed by the terrifying sound of shredding metal. The calm voice of the academic was gone, replaced by the primal scream of a man plunging from the sky. The final sound on the recording was not the crash itself, but a single, sharp, and inexplicably clear word from Eris Thorne, a word that was half prayer, half curse. "It's in my hand." Then there was only static, a roaring, empty sound that was more profound and chilling than any scream. Cale sat in the silence of his office for a long time, the hiss of the dead recording, the only sound, the final cryptic message of the deceased researcher echoing in his mind. The investigation had just begun, and it was already descending into the impossible. The day after absorbing Thorne's final transmission, Cale found himself walled in by paper. The preliminary reports from the Brazilian Air Force, Força Aérea Brasileira, or FAB, were stacked neatly on his desk, a testament to procedure and futility. Each page was a dry, factual account of failure, a chronicle of the immense challenge of finding a single downed aircraft in 67 million hectares of jungle. He picked up the top summary, the paper cool and impersonal under his touch. It detailed the official launch of the search and rescue operation, time-stamped to the minute, a clinical response to a desperate situation. The report listed the assets deployed: 2 C-130 Hercules aircraft for high-altitude visual and radar sweeps, and 3 H-60 Black Hawk helicopters for low-altitude searches. The sheer scale of the operation was impressive on paper, a display of military capability against an indomitable foe. But Cale knew the truth of the Amazon. It did not yield its secrets to technology so easily. The dense, triple-layer canopy acted as a shroud, hiding the earth below from even the most sophisticated sensors. He scanned the flight logs, his eyes tracing the meticulous grid patterns the search planes had flown. Each line on the map represented hours of monotonous flight, pilots and spotters straining their eyes against a uniform, unbroken sea of green. The reports noted the challenging weather conditions, the same unexpected front Thorne's pilot had mentioned, which had severely hampered the initial, most critical phase of the search. It was a classic case of bad luck compounding a tragedy, or so the official narrative suggested. Cale felt a familiar knot of frustration tighten in his gut, a ghost of a past failure. Years ago, he had been part of a similar effort to locate an uncontacted tribe whose territory was threatened by illegal loggers. By the time they found the tribe's last known encampment, it was too late. The loggers had gotten there first, and the silence they left behind was a testament to his team's inability to navigate the green immensity in time. That failure was a heavy cloak he wore every day, a constant private reminder of the stakes of his work. The reports from the FAB pilots were filled with professional jargon and objective observations, but Cale could read the frustration between the lines. They described a featureless and uniform canopy and no visual anomalies consistent with a crash site. The jungle, in its quiet, implacable way, was protecting its own, swallowing the metal bird whole and leaving no trace for those who soared above. It was a narrative as old as the first expeditions into this wilderness. He turned his attention to the infrared scans taken during the night flights. These were supposed to be the key, the technological ace capable of detecting the heat signature of wreckage against the cool backdrop of the nocturnal forest. The resulting images were a ghostly tableau of black and white, mottled with the faint heat of living things, but there was no man-made flare of hot metal, no telltale signature of a downed Cessna. The wreckage was cold, or it was simply too well hidden. The search continued for 72 hours, the critical window for finding potential survivors, with no results. The official reports became more procedural, the language shifting from urgent search and rescue to a more sober search and recovery. Cale knew this shift well. It was the moment when hope was officially archived and replaced by the grim logistics of finding the dead. The vastness of the search area, combined with the lack of an emergency locator transmitter signal from the plane, made the task a statistical nightmare. He thought back to Thorne's last transmission. The researcher had been descending, going off the planned route to investigate the anomalous depression. This deviation, driven by the thrill of discovery, had likely sealed his fate, taking him into a region even more remote and uncharted than his original flight path had intended. He had flown into a blank spot on the map, and in doing so, had vanished from the world. A new report was printed and handed to him by a junior analyst, its paper still warm. It was a transcript of interviews with personnel at the research base where Thorne was headed. They confirmed Thorne's obsession with the folklore of a little-known indigenous group, the Uru-Wawa, who spoke of a star that fell to Earth and a plant that shines with the light of the moon. The official scientific community had dismissed these as myths, but Thorne had believed there was a kernel of truth to the stories, a truth he was willing to risk his life for. Catel pushed the stack of papers away and stood, walking to the window that overlooked the sterile, manicured lawns of the ministry complex. The controlled, predictable geometry of the city stood in stark contrast to the chaotic, untamable wilderness he was tasked with policing. The silence from the jungle was not an absence of sound, but a presence, a living, breathing entity that held the secrets of Eris Thorne's death. The official search had failed, but for Catel, the true investigation was just beginning, starting with a whisper of impossible legends and the deep green quiet where a plane had simply ceased to exist. He knew he had to go there himself. The answers were not in these reports, but under that canopy. The call came on the fourth day, a crackled, triumphant burst of communication from a Black Hawk crew that cut through the miasma of failure. A chance glint of reflected sunlight off a shard of metal, visible for only a few seconds through a momentary gap in the clouds, had given the location away. The wreckage of Papa Tango 39er Charlie was located in a section of the Ituna Itata Indigenous Territory, a federally protected area so remote and dense with primary forest that it was almost never entered. Before traveling to the site, Cale was presented with the initial visual evidence transmitted via a satellite link to a hardened laptop in a staging area. The first images to appear on the screen were from high altitude, showing a barely perceptible disturbance in the otherwise uniform tapestry of the canopy. It was a slight discoloration, a splash of silver and white against the emerald, like a tear in a priceless fabric. To an untrained eye it was nothing, but to Cale it was the final, ugly punctuation mark on Eris Thorne's life. He zoomed in, the image pixelating slightly before resolving into a clearer, more brutal picture. The Cessna was not intact. It had been utterly shattered, its fuselage ripped open and strewn across the crowns of several massive Brazil nut trees 150 feet above the jungle floor. The wings were sheared off, wrapped around thick trunks, and the tail section was perched precariously on a high branch, a monument to the violence of the impact. It was a scene of total devastation. The next file was a video feed, relayed from the helmet camera of the 1st FAB Commando to rappel down to the site. The footage was dizzying, a vertiginous descent through layers of canopy, flashes of green and brown whipping past the camera lens. The sounds were of the commando's strained breathing and the whir of the helicopter blades high above, a lifeline back to the outside world. As he neared the wreckage, the scale of the destruction became more intimate and more horrifying. The camera panned across the mangled cockpit. The instrument panel was a ruin of shattered glass and twisted wires, a testament to the complete system's failure Thorne had screamed about in his final moments. The commando moved with methodical precision, his gloved hands carefully checking for any signs of life, a grim formality in the face of such obvious catastrophe. The silence from within the wreckage was absolute. Then the camera found him. Dr. Eris Thorne was still strapped into his passenger seat, his body thrown forward by the force of the impact. The commando's movements became more somber, his breathing steadying as his training took over. He made no comment, simply allowing the lens to document the scene for the investigators who would follow. Catel watched the unblinking eye of the camera, feeling a grim professional detachment settle over him. The official report that accompanied the video was concise and to the point. The scene was consistent with a high-speed, uncontrolled descent resulting in catastrophic structural failure upon impact with the treetops. There were no initial signs of fire or explosion, suggesting a mechanical or electrical failure, not an act of sabotage. It was a clean, straightforward tragedy, the kind that was sadly not uncommon in the unforgiving Amazon. The recovery team's notes detailed the difficulty of the operation. The location was nearly inaccessible, the trees too dense for a landing, forcing all personnel and equipment to be winched down from the hovering Black Hawk. The oppressive heat and humidity, combined with the constant drone of insects, made the work physically and mentally taxing. Every piece of debris would have to be carefully cataloged, bagged, and airlifted out for analysis, a painstaking process that would take days. Cale focused on a still frame from the video, an image of Thorne's section of the fuselage. The researcher's body was slumped, but his right arm was extended, reaching towards the floor of the ruined cabin. His hand was clenched into a tight fist, so tight that the knuckles were white. The commando in the video had noted it as a sign of rigor mortis, a common physiological reaction to a violent death. But Cabell leaned closer to the screen, a flicker of doubt in his mind. It wasn't just a fist. It looked as though Thorne was clutching something small that was concealed entirely within his grasp. He replayed Thorne's final garbled words in his head. "It's in my hand." The official report from the on-site team made no mention of an object, but they hadn't been looking for one. They had been conducting a recovery, not a criminal investigation. A cold certainty began to form in Cabell's mind. He had to get to that crash site before the scene was completely processed and sanitized by procedure. The story of mechanical failure was neat and tidy, but Eris Thorne's last words and his tightly clenched fist suggested a far more complicated and dangerous truth was tangled in the wreckage, waiting to be found. The air at the hastily assembled jungle clearing was thick enough to drink, a suffocating cocktail of humidity, decaying vegetation, and aviation fuel. The percussive thrum of the Black Hawk's rotors beat down as Kahlo stepped out, the wind whipping at his worn funai vest. The jungle was a solid wall of green on all sides, and the noise was overwhelming, a billion insects, birds, and unseen creatures creating a deafening, incessant chorus that vibrated in his teeth. He was now in the world that had consumed Eris Thorne, and the sense of isolation was immediate and profound. An exhausted-looking Fab Major, his uniform stained with sweat, met him under the rotor wash and led him toward a temporary command tent. "Investigator," he shouted over the noise. "Welcome to hell." Inside the tent, the roar of the jungle was only slightly muted, replaced by the hum of portable generators and the crackle of radios. On a folding table, maps and preliminary reports were laid out, a futile attempt to impose order on the chaos outside. "My team has completed the initial recovery of the victim and the most critical components," the Major explained. Pointing to a manifest list, "The flight recorder, or what's left of it, is being prepped for transport. The rest of the wreckage will take days to clear." He spoke with the weary professionalism of a man who just wanted the job to be over. Cale nodded, his eyes scanning the tent, absorbing every detail. "I need to see the body before it's transported," Cale stated, his voice calm but firm. "And I want a full inventory of the personal effects recovered from the cabin, specifically anything found on or near the victim." The Major raised an eyebrow, a silent question about the unusual request from a Funai agent in what was clearly a military-led recovery. Cale offered no explanation. His jurisdiction in cases involving protected indigenous lands and the people within them gave him the authority he needed. They walked to a refrigerated medical tent, the sudden chill inside a shocking contrast to the oppressive heat. Dr. Thorne's body lay in a sealed, heavy-duty bag. A military medic stood by, ready to brief him on the obvious trauma, but Cale held up a hand, his focus singular. "The report from your first response commando noted the victim's right hand was in a state of cadaveric spasm," Cale said, his gaze fixed on the bag. "Was anything recovered from his hand when it was opened?" The medic glanced at the Major, who gave a slight nod. "Yes, sir," the medic replied, turning to a small refrigerated container. "It was a strange one. We had to pry his fingers open. He was holding this." He retrieved a sealed, transparent evidence bag and placed it on a stainless steel tray. "We logged it as an unidentified personal item. A piece of jewelry, maybe? Or some kind of geological sample." Cale stepped forward, his heart beginning to beat a heavy, deliberate rhythm against his ribs. Inside the bag was an object that defied easy description. It was a small polyhedron, no larger than a bird's egg, with a surface that was a deep, matte black, seeming to drink the light from the tent's single fluorescent bulb. Its shape was impossibly complex, a series of interlocking geometric faces that shifted and changed as Cale tilted his head, a trick of light and shadow that seemed to defy the laws of perspective. He picked up the evidence bag, the object inside feeling heavier than it should. The surface was perfectly smooth, without a single seam, scratch, or imperfection, despite having been at the center of a catastrophic plane crash. It was not metal, not stone, not plastic. It was made of a material he had never seen, cool to the touch, even through the plastic. This was it. This was what Thorne had found, what he had clutched in his final, desperate moments. "Have you identified the material?" Cale asked, his voice low. The medic shook his head. "We can't. It's not in any of our databases. It's incredibly dense, and it doesn't respond to magnetic tests. It's completely inert." Inert. Yet Thorne's final words had been about a plant that was glowing, broadcasting an energy signature. This object felt like a quiet, sleeping thing, but Cale knew it was the key. This was no accident. A man does not die clutching a geological sample or a piece of jewelry with that kind of death grip. He dies clutching the most important thing in the world, the object of his discovery or the reason for his murder. The neat official story of mechanical failure evaporated in the cold air of the medical tent, replaced by 100 dark and urgent questions. Cale looked from the impossible object to the major. "This entire crash site is now a potential crime scene," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I want a full forensic sweep of the wreckage, and I am taking personal custody of this artifact. Nothing else leaves this jungle without my direct authorization." The major's exhaustion was replaced by a look of sharp attention. The investigation had just taken a radical, unforeseen turn, and the small, dark object in Cale's hand was now the silent, unnerving center of it all. It was a piece of the puzzle that didn't fit, a technologically impossible artifact that whispered of a truth far more terrifying than a simple plane crash. The preliminary autopsy report arrived not as a physical document, but as an encrypted data burst sent directly to Cale's secure field laptop. He sat in the sweltering command tent, the jungle's cacophony a constant pressing reminder of their isolation, and stared at the clinical, dispassionate text on the screen. The initial findings from the medical examiner in Manaus were on the surface entirely predictable. The cause of death for Dr. Eris Thorne was listed as massive blunt force trauma, with injuries consistent with a high-velocity impact. There were no surprises there. The state of the wreckage had already told that part of the story. Cale scrolled down through the grim inventory of fractures and internal injuries, the cold language of pathology painting a brutal picture of Thorne's final moments. It was a report that would have comfortably closed any ordinary case file, attributing the death to the physics of the crash itself. But this case was anything but ordinary, and Cale's focus was on the toxicology and radiological screening sections, the places where subtler truths might hide. And there it was, a single, anomalous line in the radiological analysis section that made the air in the tent feel suddenly cold. Thorne's tissues showed trace amounts of an unusual radioactive isotope, one that the ME's lab could not immediately identify. It was not an element found in nature, nor was it one associated with any known industrial or medical applications. It was, the report noted, an isotope with a bizarrely short half-life, suggesting Thorne's exposure to it had been very, very recent. Cale read the line again, the words seeming to hum with significance. An unknown isotope, a recent exposure. He thought of Thorne's excited description of an energy signature, his awestruck whisper about a glowing plant. The science was now backing up the legend, adding a layer of terrifying, tangible reality to what had sounded like myth. The researcher hadn't just found a new species, he had found something that defied the known principles of biology and physics. He minimized the autopsy report, his mind racing, and opened a direct communication channel to the forensics team still working at the treetop crash site. The team leader, a grim-faced woman named Sophia, appeared on the screen, her face beaded with sweat, the mangled fuselage visible behind her. "Anything to report?" Cale asked, keeping his voice even. "Anything that contradicts the mechanical failure theory?" Sophia nodded, a grim set to her jaw. "We found the flight data recorder, or what SIP's left of it," she reported, her voice strained over the connection. "It wasn't SEP damaged in the crash. She paused for effect, letting the statement sink in. It was deliberately destroyed. Cale felt a surge of adrenaline, the kind that came when disparate pieces of a puzzle suddenly snapped together. "Explain," he commanded. Sophia held up a sealed bag containing a mangled black box, its tough casing peeled open like a grotesque fruit. The impact damage to this section of the tail was significant, but the recorder itself is housed in a reinforced crash-proof casing designed to withstand far worse. The casing wasn't breached by the impact. She pointed to the damage with a gloved finger. "These marks? This is the result of a concentrated high-energy cutting tool, something like a plasma torch, and the internal memory boards weren't just shattered, they were pulverized, ground into dust. Someone went to a lot of trouble to make sure the last minutes of this flight were permanently erased." The two facts hung in Cale's mind, orbiting each other like binary stars of dread, a mysterious radioactive plant and a deliberately, expertly destroyed flight recorder. These were not the hallmarks of an accident. They were the clear, unambiguous footprints of a cover-up, an act of violent, calculated silencing. The official narrative was now not just wrong, it was a deliberate fiction. "Was there any other evidence of tampering?" Cale asked, his mind already leaping ahead. "Anything that could have caused the system's failure?" Thorne reported. Sophia shook her head. "That's the strange part. We've examined the engine, the control surfaces, the electrical systems. There's no evidence of a pre-impact bomb, no sign of sabotage that would have caused the plane to lose power like that. Whatever brought this plane down, it wasn't a conventional explosive device. It was a contradiction that only deepened the mystery. The plane had suffered a total systems failure, yet bore no signs of conventional sabotage, while the one piece of evidence that could explain it was professionally obliterated." Cale thanked Sophia and cut the connection, the screen going dark. He was left in the dim light of the tent, the two reports opened side by side on his laptop, a body contaminated with an unknown element and a flight recorder that had been murdered. He looked over at the small Pelican case on the table beside him, the case where he had secured the impossible artifact. It lay there, silent and inert, yet he knew, with a certainty that resonated deep in his bones, that it was connected to all of it. Thorne had found something extraordinary. Something that produced energy and emitted radiation, and someone else had wanted it badly enough to kill for it, to rip a plane from the sky, and then meticulously erase the evidence, leaving behind only a corpse, a puzzle, and a profound, terrifying silence. With the crash site yielding more questions than answers, Cale shifted the focus of the investigation to the life of Eris Thorne himself. From the field command tent, a world away from sterile archives and data centers, his team in Brasilia worked to obtain the necessary warrants. Within hours, they had been granted access to the entirety of the late doctor's professional life, his university research grants, his encrypted personal data logs, and his confidential correspondence. Cale spent the next 2 days immersed in the digital ghost of the man he was trying to avenge, sifting through the detritus of a brilliant and secretive career. The public-facing research proposals were a model of academic rigor. They detailed a multi-year ethnobotanical study of the Amazon basin, with a stated goal of cataloging new species of flora and documenting the traditional plant-based medicine of isolated indigenous communities. The work was funded by a consortium of reputable academic institutions and conservation groups. It was the perfect cover, a plausible and admirable scientific endeavor that concealed a far more radical and dangerous objective. The truth lay hidden in the encrypted data logs which Cale's cybersecurity team managed to unlock after a day of focused effort. Here Thorne's research took on a completely different character. He had compiled decades of anthropological field notes, explorers' journals, and satellite topographical data, cross-referencing them with the oral histories of local tribes. He was searching for a specific place, the caldera he described in his final transmission, and a specific plant, a bioluminescent anomaly that the Uru-Wawa tribe called Ona Kasti, or the Sun Eater. According to the legends Thorne had painstakingly translated, the Sun Eater was not a plant in the traditional sense. It was a life form that drew its energy not from photosynthesis, but directly from geothermal and radiological sources deep within the earth. The tribe believed it was a piece of a star that had fallen into the jungle millennia ago, and that it held the power to create light without fire and energy without heat. Thorne's private notes revealed his scientific hypothesis that Anacostia represented a new form of life, one that had evolved a method of biological energy production that could, if understood, revolutionize the world. This was Thorne's true secret quest, a pursuit so far outside the bounds of mainstream science that he had to hide it within the Trojan horse of a conventional research project. But a project of this magnitude requiring specialized equipment and extensive logistical support could not be funded by academic grants alone. Cale knew there had to be another source of money, and he found it buried deep within a folder of heavily redacted financial statements. A series of wire transfers, funneled through 3 layers of offshore shell corporations, led back to a single, powerful entity, the Azura Gene Corporation. Azura Gene was a biotech behemoth, a global leader in genetic engineering and pharmaceutical development, with a public image built on sustainability and life-saving innovation. Privately, however, they were known in intelligence circles for their ruthless efficiency, their aggressive patent litigation, and their history of hostile corporate espionage. The correspondence between Thorne and a high-level, unnamed executive at Azura Gene was conducted through a secure, encrypted channel. Cale read the messages, his sense of dread growing with each exchange. Azura Gene had been secretly funding Thorne's expedition for over a year, providing him with advanced spectral analysis equipment and logistical support in exchange for exclusive rights to any and all discoveries. The corporation knew exactly what he was looking for, and they understood its world-changing potential. The final messages, sent just days before Thorne's fatal flight, were chilling. The Azura Gene executive was growing impatient, pressing Thorne for tangible results and reminding him of the strict non-disclosure clauses in their contract. Thorne, in his replies, was evasive and protective of his research, promising a major breakthrough but refusing to share the exact location of the caldera until he had confirmed the discovery himself. He was trying to maintain control over his life's work, to keep it from being swallowed whole by his ruthless benefactors. It was a fatal miscalculation. Cale could see the entire conspiracy laid bare in the digital text. Thorne, the brilliant but naive academic, believed he could control a force like Azura Gene. He thought he was their partner, when in reality he was merely their disposable asset. When he finally found the Sun Eater, and the impossible artifact that was perhaps its key or its fruit, he had signed his own death warrant. Cale closed the laptop, the green glow of the screen reflecting in his eyes. The motive was no longer a mystery. It was the oldest one in the book: corporate greed, magnified to an unimaginable scale. Azura Gene hadn't just wanted Thorne's research, they wanted the source, and they were willing to commit murder and sabotage to secure it, burying the truth under the guise of a tragic accident in the vast, silent Amazon. The enemy now had a name, but they were a faceless, powerful corporation, and Cale knew that proving their involvement would require more than just a dead man's encrypted files. He needed evidence that was as tangible and undeniable as the impossible artifact locked in the case beside him. The impossible artifact had to be analyzed in secret. Cale arranged for a trusted, discreet expert from the University of Sao Paulo's physics department, a woman named Dr. Elara Vance, with whom he had worked on a previous, sensitive case, to be flown to the edge of the exclusion zone. They set up a makeshift laboratory in a secure, shielded container, the only island of true sterility and silence for 100 miles, the jungle's oppressive chorus held at bay by insulated walls. Inside, under the glare of focused lamps, the dark polyhedron sat on an analysis platform, its presence seeming to warp the very air around it. Dr. Vance, a woman with a calm demeanor that belied a fiercely brilliant mind, began with non-invasive scans. She subjected the artifact to a battery of tests: X-ray fluorescence, magnetic resonance imaging, and neutron activation analysis. The results that spooled out onto her monitors were, in her own words, a scientific nightmare. The material composition did not match any known element or alloy. It was a complex crystalline structure of carbon and silicon arranged in a lattice that was theoretically impossible to synthesize under any known conditions of temperature or pressure. "It's as if the atoms themselves are woven together, not bonded," Vance murmured, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and intellectual fervor. "The density is extraordinary, far beyond osmium or iridium, yet it is not metallic in the way we understand it. She showed Cale the scans, pointing to the intricate repeating patterns of its internal structure. It was perfectly ordered without the slightest flaw. The next discovery was even more profound. When subjected to gamma-ray spectroscopy, the artifact revealed a faint but distinct energy signature. It was passively emitting a low level of radiation, a unique energy profile that was an exact match for the anomalous isotope found in Eris Thorne's body. The link was now absolute and undeniable. Thorne had been in direct physical contact with this object shortly before his death. He must have been holding it for a significant period, Vance theorized, her gaze fixed on the radiation plot. The isotope has a remarkably short half-life, a matter of hours. The exposure was acute and recent. This object was the source. The artifact was not merely a passive object. It was active, broadcasting a faint energy, just as Thorne had reported in his final, excited log entry. The final analysis produced the most unsettling discovery of all. Using a high-resolution electron microscope, Dr. Vance was able to peer at the very surface of the polyhedron. What had appeared perfectly smooth to the naked eye was, at a microscopic level, covered in patterns of almost unimaginable complexity. They were not natural formations. They were etched lines and nodes that resembled nothing less than integrated circuitry, but on a scale and of a design that was generations beyond anything in public, or even classified, development. "This isn't a rock, Cale," Vance said, her voice barely a whisper as she stared at the magnified image on the screen. "This is a piece of technology. The patterns, they're like microscopic data conduits. It's a machine, or a component of one, of a type I cannot begin to comprehend." It was a device that operated on principles they did not understand, built from materials they could not identify, possessing a level of miniaturization that defied modern engineering. The origin of the artifact was now the central, terrifying question. It was clearly not man-made, not by any known nation or corporation. The alternative was a possibility so staggering that both Cale and Vance left it unspoken in the sterile air of the container. It was the physical proof of Thorne's most outlandish theories, the tangible product of the legendary Sun-Eater plant. Cale stared at the object, which now seemed less like a clue and more like a harbinger. It was a piece of advanced technology that had been sitting in the heart of the Amazon, waiting to be found. Thorne had found it, and Azura Jean, through his research, knew of its existence. They didn't just want a new species of plant, they wanted this, a key to a new technological paradigm, an object worth killing for, worth starting a war for. The investigation had moved beyond corporate malfeasance and into uncharted territory. Cale now possessed the one thing Azura Jean had presumably failed to recover from the crash, the prize itself. He knew that their silence and the neatness of the accident meant they likely believed the artifact was lost or destroyed in the crash. It was his only advantage, a secret weapon in an undeclared war. He had the motive, he had the murder weapon in the form of a sabotaged investigation, and now he had the prize, a silent, black polyhedron that held the secrets of a new science and the truth of Eris Thorne's death. The forensic evidence was damning but circumstantial. Cole had the motive in Azura Jean's secret funding and the means in the professionally sabotaged flight recorder, but he lacked the direct link, the smoking gun that would place the corporation's agents physically in the remote jungle at the time of the crash. The immensity of the Amazon that had hidden the wreckage so well was now hiding the perpetrators just as effectively. He needed to find a footprint in the green hell, a sign of an unnatural intrusion that coincided with Thorne's death. Frustrated with the lack of ground leads, Cale turned his gaze skyward. He requisitioned high-resolution satellite imagery from every available source, commercial, governmental, and military. He requested archival data for the entire sector, covering the 2 weeks leading up to the crash and the week following it. The data flowed into the field command post, terabytes of it, and Cale, alongside a remote imaging analyst, began the painstaking task of comparing the images, looking for the tiniest change, the smallest anomaly in the millions of square kilometers of rainforest. For days they scanned, their eyes growing weary from staring at the endless, shifting patterns of green. They used change detection algorithms to highlight differences between passes, but most were natural: the shadow of a cloud, the temporary flooding of a riverbank, the fall of an ancient tree. It was a search for a needle in a world-sized haystack, a test of patience and resolve. Cale felt the pressure of time. The longer the investigation took, the colder the trail would become, and the more opportunity Azura Gene would have to bury their involvement under layers of legal and political influence. On the third day of the satellite search, the analyst flagged a potential point of interest. It was deep within the Itstuna Itsta territory, approximately 50 kilometers from the crash site in a region designated as completely uninhabited. In an image taken a week before the crash, the area was an unbroken expanse of primary forest. But in an image from the day before Thorn's flight, a new feature was visible, a thin, perfectly straight line, dark against the lighter green of the canopy. Cale zoomed in, his pulse quickening. The line was too straight, its edges too clean to be a natural feature like a river or a geological fault. It was an artificial scar, approximately 1.5 kilometers long, carved directly out of the dense jungle. It was a landing strip, unauthorized, uncharted, and expertly concealed from ground-level view by the remaining high canopy on its borders. It was a surgical intrusion into the heart of the wilderness. He pulled up the imagery for the following days. In the data from the day of the crash, taken just hours after Thorn's plane went down, the image of the landing strip was subtly different. The analyst ran a thermal trace and a soil disturbance analysis. The results were clear. The strip showed signs of recent heavy use. Faint heat signatures consistent with a large aircraft engine were still detectable, and the compacted earth bore the distinct pressure marks of heavy landing gear. The analyst cross-referenced the estimated track width and weight distribution with a database of known aircraft. The profile matched that of a heavy-lift cargo plane, something like an Antonov An-12 or a Lockheed C-130, an aircraft capable of carrying significant equipment and personnel. This was not the work of local smugglers or illegal miners who used smaller, less sophisticated planes. This was the signature of a well-funded, highly organized covert operation. An unseen presence had been there, on the ground, operating in the shadows. They had built a secret airfield, flown in a major operation, and had been active at the precise time Thorn was making his discovery. Cale's theory of the crime solidified into a cold, hard certainty. Azura Gene hadn't just funded Thorn, they had deployed their own parallel team, a security or extraction unit, to monitor him and, when the time came, to seize his discovery. They didn't sabotage his plane remotely. Cale now believed they had forced it down, perhaps using some unknown technology to trigger the system's failure Thorn had reported. They were on the ground waiting for him, and when he crashed, they were the first on the scene. They had killed him, taken whatever he had found, unaware that he still clutched the most important piece in his hand, and then surgically destroyed the flight recorder to erase any evidence of their presence before vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. The hidden landing strip was the theater for the crime, the missing link that connected the corporate conspiracy to the physical act of murder. Cale now had a location, a tangible place to focus the next stage of his investigation. He knew that sending a team to the strip would be a gamble. It had likely been sanitized. But it was his only lead, a faint trail left by the ghosts who had come in on a heavy plane, committed murder in the treetops, and flown away with a secret that could change the world, leaving a dead scientist and an impossible artifact in their wake. Just as Cale was preparing to dispatch a team to the clandestine landing strip, a message came that changed everything. It arrived, not through any technological channel, but through a human one, a network of trust he had spent years building. A Funai field agent working on the edge of the Ituna Itata Reserve made contact, reporting that a group of Uru Wawa hunters had approached him with an incredible story. They had found a man in the jungle, near death, days after the sound of the falling plane had echoed through their territory. They had rescued him, and he was now recovering in their village, terrified and delirious. Cale knew this was a development he had to handle personally. He took a helicopter to the reserve demarcation point and then traveled for a day on foot, guided by two of the Uru Uwa hunters. They moved through the jungle with a silent grace that made his own progress feel clumsy and loud. It was a journey into the heart of the world that Thorn had tried to understand, a world that operated on principles far older than corporate greed. The respect he had shown these communities in the past was now being repaid, granting him access to a secret he never could have found on his own. The village was a small, quiet clearing, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. The tribe's shaman met him, his face a mask of deep-carved lines, and after a formal, respectful exchange, led Kala to a small, isolated hut. Inside, lying on a woven hammock, was a man Kala recognized from the flight manifest photographs, Ricardo Maya, the co-pilot of Thorn's Cessna, a man who had been officially listed as deceased, his body presumed lost to the jungle. Medea was emaciated, his eyes wide with fever and terror, his arm set in a crude but effective splint. When he saw Kalu, he flinched, a primal fear seizing him. Kalu spoke to him softly in Portuguese, identifying himself and assuring him that he was safe. It took hours of patient talk, of providing clean water and medical supplies, before Medea's terror subsided enough for him to speak, his voice a hoarse, broken whisper. His confession, when it came, was a torrent of horrifying truth that washed away every last theory Kalu had constructed. "They were waiting for us," Maya rasped, his eyes darting towards the hut's entrance, as if expecting death to walk through it at any moment. "It wasn't a mechanical failure. They shot us down." He described a flash of light from the ground, followed by a complete and instantaneous shutdown of every electrical system on the plane. The controls went dead, the engine silent, and they simply fell from the sky, helpless. It was a weapon, he insisted, not a missile, but a beam of some kind that killed the technology of the plane, stone dead. The crash itself was a nightmare of screaming metal and snapping trees. Madia was thrown clear of the wreckage on impact, his body broken but alive. He lost consciousness, and when he awoke, he saw them. A team of 4 figures, dressed in dark tactical gear without insignia, were moving through the wreckage. They were not a rescue team. They moved with cold, predatory efficiency. They were Azura Jean's ground team. "They found Thorn," Maya whispered, his voice catching in a sob. He was still alive, barely. Their leader knelt beside him and demanded the location of the plant and the object he had found. Thorn, defiant to the last, refused to speak. The team leader then executed him without hesitation, a single silenced pistol shot that Maya heard even in his dazed state. The team then searched the wreckage for the artifact Thorn had mentioned in his panicked radio calls. They were meticulous, but in the chaos and ruin of the cabin, they failed to find it, assuming it must have been destroyed or lost in the fall. To cover their tracks, they used a cutting torch to destroy the flight recorder, and then they did something that chilled Kale to the bone. They rigged the wreckage with small, precisely placed thermite charges, designed not to create a large explosion, but to melt and warp key mechanical components, to create the false evidence of a catastrophic engine failure for investigators to find later. They had left Maya for dead, a miscalculation born of arrogance. He had been saved by the Iru Iwawa, the very people whose knowledge Thorn had respected and Azura Jean had sought to exploit. The co-pilot's testimony was the missing piece, the first-hand account that transformed the entire investigation. It was no longer a case of a corporate conspiracy leading to an indirect death. It was a story of a targeted takedown, a cold-blooded execution, and a deliberate expert staging of a crime scene. Kekel now had his witness. He had the survivor who could identify the killers, describe their methods, and testify to their motives. Combined with the impossible artifact still locked in its case and the discovery of the secret landing strip, he had a case that could not be buried. The truth was far more brutal and direct than he had imagined, and the quiet, terrified man in the hammock was now the most important and the most endangered person in the entire Amazon. The journey back from the Uru Iwawa village was fraught with a new and urgent tension. Kayla now carried more than just evidence. He was the guardian of a human life, the sole witness who could burn Azura Jean's entire covert operation to the ground. Ricardo Maya, the co-pilot, was airlifted under the highest level of secrecy to a secure military hospital, his identity scrubbed from all public records, becoming a ghost in the system, protected by the very state apparatus Azura Jean believed it could manipulate. Back at the field command post, which now felt more like a forward operating base in a war, Kale began the final and most critical phase of his work. He sat before his secure laptop, the hum of the generator a steady companion against the ever-present chorus of the jungle outside. His task was to weave every disparate thread of the investigation into a single, unbreakable chain of evidence, a formal report that would be delivered not to the public, but directly to the highest levels of the public prosecutor's office and the Brazilian intelligence community. He started with the voice of Aris Thorn, transcribing the awe and terror of the final transmission. He placed it alongside the cold, scientific language of the autopsy report, the impossible detail of the unidentified isotope, creating a chilling harmony with the researcher's last words. He laid out the meticulous analysis of Thorn's hidden research, the obsessive quest for Onacasté, and the damning financial trail that led directly to the front door of the Azura Gene Corporation. Each sentence was a brick in the wall of his case, laid with precision and backed by verifiable data. Then came the physical evidence, the core of the indictment. He detailed Dr. Vance's stunning analysis of the impossible artifact, its composition, its energy signature, and its microscopic circuitry, a piece of technology that was, in itself, a motive for murder. He paired this with the satellite imagery of the clandestine landing strip, the undeniable proof of a secret and sophisticated presence in a supposedly untouched wilderness. The artifact was the prize, and the landing strip was the theater of the crime. The climax of his report was the sworn videotaped testimony of Ricardo Matea. Cale structured it as a narrative, a harrowing first-person account of the attack, the execution of Dr. Thorn, and the deliberate staging of the crash site. Matea's testimony was the human heart of the cold, hard evidence, the voice that spoke for the dead and pointed an unwavering finger at the guilty. He described the tactical gear of the assassins, the advanced weapon they used to bring down the plane, and the cold professionalism with which they murdered a man for his discovery. Cale knew that the moment he transmitted this report, a war would begin. Azura Gene was not merely a corporation, it was a global power with tendrils reaching into politics, finance, and the media. They would deploy armies of lawyers, lobbyists, and public relations experts to discredit the evidence, to paint Maya as a delusional survivor, and to portray Cale himself as a rogue agent pursuing a vendetta. They would try to bury the truth under an avalanche of money and influence. He paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, and looked at the Pelican case that held the artifact. That small, dark object was the one thing they could not explain away. It was a piece of reality that didn't fit their world, and it was his ultimate leverage. He added a final, confidential addendum to the report, recommending that the artifact not be entered into evidence publicly, but be held by a secret military research unit as a matter of national security. Its existence, if revealed, could destabilize the world far beyond the courtroom. As he prepared to seal and transmit the file, Cale felt the full weight of his responsibility. He was fighting not just for justice for one dead scientist, but for something far larger. He was fighting to protect the sanctity of the Amazon, a place of secrets that should be allowed to reveal themselves through careful study, not be ripped out by violent corporate greed. He was fighting for the rule of law against the insidious power of those who believe themselves to be above it. The jungle had given him a witness and had yielded the truth. And now, as he sent the report into the digital ether, he knew the battle was moving from the quiet green hell of the rainforest to the loud, concrete jungle of power and politics, and he was ready.